Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Testing Psychologist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Sharp, licensed psychologist, group practice owner, and private practice coach. Many of y'all know that I have been using Therapy Notes as our practice EHR for over 10 years now. I've looked at others, and I just keep coming back to Therapy Notes because they do it all. If you're interested in an EHR for your practice, you can get 2 free months of Therapy Notes by going to thetestingpsychologist.com/therapy notes and enter the code TESTING. This episode is brought to you by PAR. The new PAR training platform is now available and is the new home for PAR talks, webinars, as well as on-demand learning and product training. Learn more at parinc.com/resources/PAR-training. Hey folks, welcome back to The Testing Psychologist. I'm glad to be here with you in this new year, 2025. I know this isn't the first episode of 2025, but it's the first one that I'm actually recording. So there we go. Hey, we are back. I'm back with a clinical episode, and I'm back with a return guest. Dr. Mariela Shibley is here. She's a clinical and forensic psychologist, psychoanalyst, and expert in conducting immigration evals, which we will talk a lot about today. She has a private practice in San Diego, California, where she also trains and supervises mental health professionals. Dr. Shibley is the founder of the online training program Psych Eval Coach, which trains clinicians to conduct immigration evaluations. And she authored the book Conducting Immigration Evaluations, a Practical Guide for Mental Health Professionals, published by Routledge in 2022. That was also the topic of her previous podcast episode, discussing the process of writing the book. Additionally, she serves as the Director of Mental Health at the University of California, San Diego student-run free clinic and holds an adjunct faculty position at the California School of Professional Psychology. Her latest endeavor involves establishing a nonprofit organization to increase access to low or no-cost immigration evaluations by training mental health providers and partnering with attorneys and legal nonprofits to facilitate these services to individuals in need. So, as you can tell, Mariela is back today to talk about immigration evaluations. Now, we've talked about immigration evaluations before on the podcast, and she is back because I think this discussion is very timely, given some of the changes and potential changes in our immigration system over the next months, days, or years. So we talk about how important immigration evaluations are going to be in the foreseeable future. So Mariela talks about personal experience as an immigrant and mental health professional. We talk about a little bit of the historical context of immigration in the U.S., the current climate within immigrant communities, and of course, we go into the various types of evaluations that might be needed for different immigration cases. We do talk through appropriate batteries and myths surrounding immigration evaluations. And the idea here is that you will have plenty to take away if you choose to go this route. There's a real opportunity, I think, for clinicians to both provide helpful services to the immigrant community and expand their businesses. So now, before we get to our full conversation, I think at this point in time, there may be 1 or 2 spots left in each of the cohorts of my mastermind groups. So there's a beginner group for folks starting out, an intermediate group, which I call the Get Your Life Back group for solo practitioners who are overwhelmed. And there's an advanced group for group practice owners with larger practices. They start in early February, and like I said, there may be a spot or 2 left in each one. So if you're interested, reach out at thetestingpsychologist.com/consulting. You can schedule a call and we can talk about if it's a good fit for you. But at this point in time, we are going to jump to my conversation with Dr. Mariela Shibley. Mariela, hey, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. We talked last time about your adventures in writing a book, and now you're back to talk about immigration evals, which is a timely topic right now, I think.
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, I will start with the question that I always start with, which is why this and why now? Why is this important? Why spend your time and energy and life on this particular topic right now?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as a mental health professional, my goal from the get-go was, to help people and to improve their quality of life, right? And the way that I got involved in immigration evaluations was partly, personal background. So I'm an immigrant myself, and I was undocumented for a few years, and so I know what it's like, how hard it is, the whole process. And then also, so basically I got contacted by immigration attorneys who knew my husband, who was an attorney, and they asked me to do these evaluations. And the reason for that is because these evaluations can be so helpful for a client's case. The issue is that the U.S. immigration system is quite biased. Okay, so it's biased against the foreign nationals who want to settle, make a life, reside here lawfully. It's very, very hard for someone who's from another country to be able to get a green card to stay here, to visit even some countries. Just to get a visa to come here can be really difficult. And the rules, in many ways, they're very arbitrary, right? So they say, well, you need to serve a penalty outside the country. You need to leave the country for 10 years. Okay, unless you can prove that a loved one will suffer extreme hardship. Okay, well, what's extreme hardship? What defines extreme, right? There's no guide, and so this is where we come in as evaluators. We try to bring a little more objectivity to this very subjective system with objective data, opinions, facts that we can provide as mental health professionals. Give it that psychological look at the situation, at the client, and so that it can substantiate their claims, their cases.
That's fair. That's fair. This might be I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but I'm just, as you get into this topic, do you know much about the sort of the history of immigration here in the country? And I mean, has it always been sort of ambiguous and tough to go through this process, or has it kind of ebbed and flowed over time?
That is so interesting that you bring that up. So I don't know if I told you, but I did start writing a second book.
You did, yes.
Which may not be published for a long time because I kind of put that on hold because I have so many things to do. But chapter 1 is already written, and chapter 1 is exactly on that. It's on the history of our immigration system. So I'm not going to read the chapter, but I will tell you that yes, it dates back many, many years, but it's always been inherently biased. They would ban groups of people, in particular Asians, were not allowed to enter the country. They were very discriminatory. The categorical. It was from the get-go biased against foreign nationals who didn't, fit the ideal of a U.S. resident in their mind. Yeah.
I see. And just to be super clear, I mean, we're talking about lawful and unlawful entry, for lack of a better term. Is that right? Am I reading that correctly?
Okay, yeah. So the U.S. has had a long and kind of complicated history with immigration. In the early days, immigration was pretty much unregulated. People came from all over, looking for freedom, opportunity. But then things changed. And as the country grew, there were economic anxieties and social tensions, and they led to the first restrictive laws. We saw things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was based on race and national origin. Basically, it banned Chinese people from coming in for a long time. Then later, there were laws that limited people from certain countries, especially from Europe. They had quotas that were very restrictive. They basically limited how many people could come from each country. And they weren't fair. They were based on the 1890 census, which meant that countries with more people of European origin from that time got bigger quotas. And so this meant that people from Southern and Eastern Europe, and basically anyone who wasn't from Western Europe, had a much harder time coming to the US. So it was really about trying to keep the country more white, which, of course, it's a really unfair and discriminatory thing to do. So then things shifted again. The 1965 Immigration Act was a really big deal. It basically got rid of those old quotas and it started focusing more on family reunification. That's when we saw a lot more people coming in from Asia, Latin America, and other places. But, there's always been this push and pull. There were concerns about how all these changes were affecting the country, the economy, even our culture. So we saw laws that would make it harder to come in, made it easier to deport people, and things like that. So, even today, it's still a really complex issue. They're trying to balance things like security and the needs of our economy. And ideally, we would want to welcome people who want to come here for a better life. But it is a constant work in progress.
And with each administration, we see new trends. And now we have an upcoming administration where pretty much everybody's frightened. Nobody knows what's really going to happen. There are some messages out there about what they anticipate will happen. Whether that actually is, ends up happening or not, we don't know. I think a lot of these goals are somewhat unrealistic and impossible. But nonetheless, the fear is very real. The fear in these communities is palpable.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. I mean, I don't want to turn this into a highly political discussion necessarily, but it's hard to avoid that. I mean, I am curious. Yeah, like when you say there's fear in these communities, and obviously you work with, these attorneys and a lot of folks involved in the community. Can you say more just about the vibe and like what people are worried about and what's making its way around?
So I mean, the message is basically they're going to deport all people who are here undocumented, right? Which is a lot of people, people, and a lot of these people live in families where one or more family members are actually U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. So this isn't just affecting the foreign national and by any means. It's affecting entire families, entire communities. This is your coworker, or this is the person that you hire for help. These are your teachers. I mean, it's everywhere. So I'm seeing kind of a repetition of what we saw in 2016. And so I work at a free clinic. It's a UCSD free clinic that it's staffed by medical students and volunteers. And pretty much all our patients are undocumented. They're individuals who don't have insurance. And we provide their services free of charge. And what happened back in 2016 is people were afraid to leave their homes because there was literally Border Patrol circling around their neighborhood and just picking people up. And that happened. That was real. And so a lot of people stopped going to work. They wouldn't come to the clinic. We had a support group. There was this thing about, they were advised to not congregate in groups because, they'd be easily targeted. And it was really, really sad because now they're anxious, they're afraid, they're suffering, and they're all alone. And yeah.
Terrible.
So I anticipate something similar to that, unfortunately, at least at the beginning, until we find out what's going to happen. But it's also the uncertainty. If you don't know if you're going to be allowed to stay or not.
Sure. I mean, we all know the stress of having like a huge, think of it as like an unclosed loop in your mind. This huge question.
Yeah, because I mean, think of so a lot of people, there's hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. who are here under temporary protected status. which is, the government basically says because of the situation in your country, right, political upheaval or natural disaster or for whatever reason, you're allowed to come and stay in the U.S. temporarily until things get better. And these are, these are renewable, so they're for a certain amount of time, and then they get renewed until the circumstances improve in their native countries. So what happens is that once that protective status is lifted, then all those people have to leave. And a lot of them have been living here for quite a few years. Perhaps they already have children who are born in the U.S. Some of them were able to adjust their status to permanent resident, which is great, but some of them weren't. And so now with this threat that they're going to terminate temporary protected status for a lot of these countries, you can imagine these families who are just like, well, I can't make long-term goals. I don't know what's going to happen. We're going to have to go. We can't go back to our country. So where are we going to go? So imagine that's like a real source of stress that will keep you up at night, that will permeate into every aspect of your life. And it really is going to take a toll on people's mental health and physical health, unfortunately.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unimaginable. Yeah, that's terrible. It's terrible. And then, so just to spell it out, I mean, how does that influence or impact our practice or the practice for, clinicians who might offer these evals?
So the evaluations can actually bring a little bit of that objectivity into this playing field, right? Because they're saying, well, in order to want to, to stay, to avoid a deportation, you can prove that a loved one, who's not just any loved one, it has to be, say, a spouse or a child or a parent. In some situations, children don't even count. They have to demonstrate that they would suffer exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. That's to avoid deportation. Okay. Can you define that for me, what that is? Yeah.
It's tough.
And they don't have a clear definition other than, something along the lines of like beyond what's typically expected. Okay, well, what's typically expected? Explain that. So you see what I mean? It's like it's very up in the air. It's very up to their discretion. And so the more evidence that the applicant has to show this, that USCIS wants to see, the stronger their case is. And what I anticipate, I mean, they've always been, pretty critical of, they look at every piece of information, but I anticipate that with this new administration, they're going to scrutinize everything that comes through their desks or that's presented in court. Yeah. And so the stronger their case is, the likelier they are to have a favorable outcome of their case. In other words, to be allowed to stay in the country.
Right. Do you think, I mean, it stands to reason that there are going to be an increase in referrals for these evals or an increased need?
And I've already started seeing it because, well, another issue is that we don't know which programs are going to stay on or not, right? So right now we have a program that's called a provisional waiver that is, for families who, say one person's, married to a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, but they've been here unlawfully for, a certain number of years. In order to adjust their status, they need to waive this like ground of inadmissibility that's called unlawful presence, meaning they were here unlawfully for a long time. The only way to waive that is if they can prove that their spouse or a parent, U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, would suffer extreme hardship if they had to separate or if they had to relocate. And you do that while you're here in the U.S., whereas a lot of these waivers, pardons, people are already separated. So one person's abroad, the other one's here. So this came out in 2013, mainly to keep families together, because these waivers were taking months, if not years, to get adjudicated. So in order to avoid that temporary family separation, they would apply for them here. So the families still stay together, apply, wait. Nowadays, it's taking 4 years to adjudicate that waiver alone. 4 years.
Oh my gosh.
4 years of limbo of like, you don't know what's going to happen. And then if that's approved, then at that point, they can leave the country to go to their consular interview in their country of citizenship, which is, your typical interview for the green card, right? Where they go and they're asked questions and they verify that it's a legitimate marriage, et cetera. And then luckily they come back unless they find another ground of inadmissibility. They bluff. They just make a mistake in their interview. They say something, I don't know, so many reasons why they get denied. But at any rate, so that program, the provisional waiver, we don't know if it's going to stay or not. Nobody knows really. So what's happening now is I'm getting flooded with referrals because attorneys are telling their clients, do it now, get it in, because even if they remove the program, they're not going to cancel. Like whoever's already in is staying in that path. So let's get it in as soon as you can. So we've seen like a significant increase in referrals for that program, for example.
I see. Yeah. This might be a good time, since we've already mentioned like a couple of sort of different circumstances, programs, waivers, et cetera, just to do a quick sort of overview of the different types of quote unquote immigration evals. Because we hear this term, and even for myself, I'm not an expert. I don't think I could like tell you the types with any accuracy. So that would probably be helpful here before we dive in deep.
So I can start with those that I already mentioned, right? So the provisional waiver, or the waiver for that matter, where the person that you're evaluating is not actually the foreign national. It's a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident who's coming in, who needs to demonstrate to USCIS that they would suffer extreme hardship if they were to be separated, or if they had to, live abroad in order to stay together with their loved one. And so those people will come to us, and we do a very thorough evaluation where, again, what's tricky about those evaluations is we're speculating, right? Because they're not separated already. So this isn't about like how you're doing right now. It's about based on how you're doing right now, based on your history, your personality characteristics, the quality of your emotional bonds with your loved ones. We can sort of anticipate how you will fare in the face of a separation from this person who, again, it also needs to demonstrate what they mean to you, right? Are they like your main source of support system? Do you have already a family that's, built around perhaps like specific roles? So one's the breadwinner, the other one's in charge of the family. So like what would happen if one of the two has to leave? So those are the waiver, or, some people call them the hardship waiver evaluations. Similarly, you have the cancellation of removal, which is pretty much the same referral question, right? What would happen if they had to separate? The difference is here, they're not separating for 10 years, they're separating forever. If they're deported, they're not allowed back. This isn't a temporary ban as with the other types. So, and the bar is set much higher in terms of what they need to prove for their suffering. But for us, it's the exact same thing, right? In terms of evaluation, we're evaluating the U.S. resident, U.S. citizen. There are some cases where we'll actually evaluate the foreign national, but those are more specific in terms of what the referral question is. So it would be for a cancellation of removal, but it's something more specific, like rehabilitation or anything like that. And then you've got all the evaluations for cases of immigration relief. So, for example, asylum, people who are applying for asylum, that's another thing. We don't know what's going to happen with asylum. With this new administration, we don't know what the requirements are going to be, if they're going to even allow it. We really don't know. And there's different types of asylum cases. And so in that case, of course, we're evaluating the foreign national. And, with asylum, for example, it could vary. It could be to document the harm that they suffered in the, as part of the persecution in their country of origin, right? Because that's why they grant asylum. Is they need to prove that they suffered persecution or they fear future persecution in part of the government or a group that the government is unable or unwilling to control, and that's based on a number of like race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Right? So in those cases, you are evaluating the foreign national, but the purpose of the evaluation might be to assess issues around credibility. So not so much about the harm they sustained, but perhaps there were some inconsistencies in their testimony, because a lot of these are handled in court. There were some things that perhaps the judge or the government attorney didn't find them credible, and so like I had one recently where they said, well, every time he talked about it, he laughed, and so they interpreted that as like, oh, he thinks it's funny. I'm thinking, well, right, exactly.
Oh,
so it takes a mental health professional to be able to explain, like, no, this is what happens when somebody's recalling a trauma that's really uncomfortable. Sometimes this anxiety gets manifested in nervous laughter. That has nothing to do with something being funny or not funny, right? So, and then there's other things like, for asylum, you need to apply within the first year of arriving to the country. So some people couldn't do that. And so they need to demonstrate that, there was a valid reason, but it's more specific, but I'm just summarizing it, that there was a valid reason that they didn't apply on time. So we can explain that from a mental health perspective, right? Then you have, evaluate victims of crimes that occurred in the U.S. Those are called U visas. Victims of domestic violence under the under VAWA. I'm having a glitch, a mental glitch. Violence Against Women Act. Sorry. Wow. Violence Against Women Act. Yeah. Which actually, it says women, but it applies equally to men and women and same-sex relationships, marriages, and not. So, so for those, again, we're evaluating the foreign national who needs to substantiate their claim that they were victims of extreme cruelty at the hands of their spouse, their U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse.
I see.
And then lastly, we have T visas. T visas are very, very popular recently. They changed the regulations last year.
Oh.
Yeah, and so they made it slightly easier, I think, for people to qualify for a T visa. It's for victims of human trafficking. And what's interesting is that, so like U visas, for example, they have a cap of 10,000 per year. So there is a wait list of, I think over 10, 15 years now, because they always meet that cap really quickly. But with T visas, the cap is 5,000 a year. And as of now, they've never met that cap. So that's why that they changed the regulations. Yeah, exactly. So now all these attorneys are like flooding, like they're just saying, you qualify, let's do this right now. Let's get in, before the waiting list develops and grows and grows. So I think that's another reason why we've been getting a lot of requests for those. And each evaluation is quite different in terms of what you need to focus on and what you need to be mindful of. So you could include certain details that might seem innocuous to you as an evaluator, but that could actually really jeopardize the client's case.
Can you think of an example right offhand where we might be doing the best that we can and inadvertently put someone in jeopardy?
So for example, you are trying to show how much a person suffered, right, as a result of, say, this intimate partner violence or a crime, etc. And the person discloses to you that they've had suicidal thoughts. No plan or intent, but, just sort of like passive suicidal ideation. And you would think that's great because that strengthens the report, right? It shows how much they're suffering. Well, it just so happens that if you mention suicide in a report to USCIS, that's going to trigger a need for clearance. They need to. They're going to have to prove that they're not a danger to themselves or others to immigration. So they're going to get a letter, a request for more evidence that says, well, the doctor here is saying that you're having thoughts of suicide. You need to prove to us that you're not going to kill yourself. So very innocuous, very like standard that you're like, yeah, the more the better, right? In terms of like how we demonstrate how they're doing.
Right.
And something like that could really jeopardize a client's case at worst. It could also happen that the attorney catches it and says, no, you can't say that. And then they say that to the evaluator. The evaluator's like, I'm sorry, I wrote it. It's what I wrote. It's what I, had to do. And so the attorney's going to say, okay, well, thank you. Then we're not going to use the report because we're not going to jeopardize the client's case.
Oh.
So then this client came in, spent a bunch of money, time, and, was hopeful about this helping, and they're not even going to use it. And the attorney's never going to refer a case to you again. Right. So this is why, it's so important to know these little intricacies. And, immigration law is the second most complex law in the country after tax law because it changes all the time. It's constantly changing. Mm-hmm. And so people need to keep up to date with the recent trends, with regulations, so that we don't make these mistakes unknowingly.
Of course. I mean, out of all the types of evals that you mentioned at this point, which ones do you feel like are the most in need or most in demand, most popular, if you want to think of it that way? It's
it depends on sort of the referral sources, right? So if you're getting referrals from a legal nonprofit, you might get a lot of asylum requests, right? But I think for the most part in general, and I would have to, I don't even know if they have these statistics, but in my experience working, about 17 years doing these evaluations, it's the waivers that are the most popular because there are so many grounds of inadmissibility. There's so many reasons why the government will say you're not allowed to stay or to enter the country. And you need to, cure those grounds of inadmissibility by proving certain things. And cancellation or removal. So what I anticipate now is cancellation or removal out, like up to the roof, for sure. Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Okay. Maybe we dive into those. Yeah, I'm thinking it would be helpful to provide some details, talk about what those look like, how to do a good eval, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we're
So for most of for cancellation or removal, they need to prove this hardship to a qualifying relative, and that relative has to be either a son or daughter, or a spouse, or a parent, all of whom are U.S. residents or lawful permanent residents, and U.S. citizens. And so what I get a lot is children. I get a lot of children referrals because they're more, it's quite easy to prove that a child will suffer if you remove their parent, believe it or not. I'm being sarcastic.
Makes sense. Mm-hmm.
It's ridiculous that they need that. But, and so what I anticipate is that we're going to be seeing a lot of these cases. And I forgot your question. About what these cases are like?
Yeah, I was just kind of diving a little deeper into what these evals look like, how to do them well, characteristics, details that we might need to know as practitioners if folks are out there like, hey, I've done a couple of these, I want to do more, or, I see this huge need and opportunity. How do I get into it?
Yeah. So we are used to, there's a lot of different types of, mental health assessments that we do, right? And perhaps we're used to going for a diagnosis and prognosis and recommendations. And in these immigration cases, sometimes the diagnosis is not as important. Or let me phrase it a different way. It's very important if there is one, but sometimes there isn't one. So you're evaluating a child, right, who's happy-go-lucky. Parents are shielding them from what's going on politically and, with their immigration status. And, they may not be at least consciously aware of what's going on. So a child is not particularly anxious just yet. So they're not going to meet criteria for a diagnosis. But there is so much you can say about this child if you start looking into like their attachment style, their history. Like they had separation anxiety when they were little. All right, well, that's a very good predictor for decompensating emotionally, more so than, like they like to say, the average person, right? If they're separated from a parent. So is really being able to focus on the referral question and honing in on that without adding extra information that's unnecessary, that can, cause these potential pitfalls that can really jeopardize a case. So,
of course.
Yeah, I don't know how much deeper you want me to go into.
Yeah. Well, maybe we take almost like a big picture overview of what does the eval process look like? So you get the referral from the attorney, presumably, and they say,
yeah, sure. Yeah.
I don't know. What do they say?
First of all, it's unlikely that you'll get the call from the attorney. So, yep. So typically the client here is a person that's coming in to see you. Right? And so the attorney referred them to you.
Yeah.
But they're the ones who are calling to schedule an appointment. And a lot of them don't really understand. They don't really know what it is that they need. So, for instance, I have an office manager here, and she is very well trained on all the different types of evaluations because she has to discern over the phone what type of evaluation they need. Is it for a VAWA? Is it for a cancellation of removal? Is it for a U visa? So she needs to know to ask the right questions because clients oftentimes have no idea. And they will say, I don't know, my attorney told me to call it and I need a letter. Well, it's not really a letter, it's a report. Right? So once you figure out, what type of case this is for, if it sounds weird and complicated, we end up calling the attorney and asking clarifying questions like, what exactly do you want me to evaluate here? But that's not the norm. These attorneys have hundreds and hundreds of cases going at the same time. And, they usually have sort of like a sheet with like checkboxes. These are all the things that you need to get me, your fingerprints, your documents, your blah, blah, blah. And psychological evaluation. Here's the number. Here's the list of numbers to call and schedule it. Right. So, so they would come in and I have them do a bunch of, different questionnaires, tests and questionnaires, pencil and paper here in the office because I like to go over them with them afterwards. So I like them to be done ahead of time before the interview. So they will do those. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I was just clarifying the process. So this is happening before the
exactly.
Intake,
so they come in and and this is the first thing that they will do. Right. So in addition to their consent forms and et cetera, they will do like a symptoms checklist. A lot of people use, back inventories or the SCL-90, whatever it is that you want to use. We all have our preferences and, right. And so it's not overwhelming by any means. And of course we have them in whatever languages they come in. And those are the ones that we use, meaning we don't translate forms of, tests that are not originally in that language. So, and I say that because again, we're evaluating even in the cases where it's a lawful permanent resident or a naturalized citizen. Oftentimes they are immigrants themselves who just happen to adjust their status, and they might prefer their native language. So we do those.
makes sense.
And then they would come in for the interview, which is around 2 hours long, depending on the case. And it's very focused on what's going to be on the report, because otherwise you would be here for hours on end. So for instance, I'm not asking a lot of questions about their educational history, right? And how they did it and what was their favorite subject and what, you don't even go near there. It's so irrelevant, right?
Yes.
That's the interview. You want to really have the referral question be the guide. How am I going to answer this referral question? What do I need? And it's one thing I think some people look at it as like everything's coming from the patient, from the client, right? They have all the information. I'm just going to sort of organize it. And the reason they come to us, mental health professionals, is because we can do a lot more than just regurgitate what the client is saying, right? Or even translate it into some jargon. We can look beyond. We can connect the dots. We can say this person has this background, so that sort of predisposed them to suffering later on. In particular, they have a propensity to compensate when they're feeling abandoned or distant from a loved one. And that is super relevant to the referral question. Or this person, they're telling you stories about their childhood. Now, what they say in the interview, they give me a lot of information, but what I end up writing in the report is, it's more concrete, it's more specific, right? But they might tell me, give me these instances of how, when they were little, a kid, stole their lunch, and they complained, and then they were the ones to get in trouble. And so from then on, they never, spoke up for themselves again, because they knew that they would be the ones to get in trouble. And now that person here is a victim of trafficking, right? And so you're trying to explain how this impacted them. And and you can go back and connect the dots and say, this is a person who early on in life learned that speaking up for themselves was not only not going to do them any good, it could actually get them in trouble. So if your referral question is like, well, why didn't they report this to the authorities? Well, here's why, right? And that's not something that if I were to ask the client, why didn't you report it? And they're going to say, oh, because when I was little, this happened. They don't make that connection, right?
Yeah.
So it's for us to really, these questions that might seem, just not that relevant perhaps to the client. Like, why are you asking me about my childhood if what we're here to talk about is what this person did to me, 2 years ago? Then that's why they come to us, the mental health professionals who know how to understand this.
Sure. This is a different flavor than I was anticipating, I think, with these evals. It's super interesting. The question that's coming up for me, I'll try to ask it in the right way, is it seems, just hearing you describe it, like it almost sounds, it sounds hard. It sounds hard because you're really looking pretty deeply and making connections that may or may not be obvious. And certainly in this case of the, those specific evals, you're sort of like projecting forward and guessing what someone might feel like. That just feels hard. I don't know. I'm curious how it feels for you, or if I'm off on.
Let's take a break to hear from a featured partner. Y'all know that I love therapy notes, but I am not the only one. They have a 4.9 out of 5-star rating on trustpilot.com and Google, which makes them the #1 rated electronic health record system available for mental health folks today. They make billing, scheduling, note-taking, and telehealth all incredibly easy. They also offer custom forms that you can send through the portal. For all the prescribers out there, Therapy Notes is proudly offering e-prescribe as well. And maybe the most important thing for me is that they have live telephone support 7 days a week, so you can actually talk to a real person in a timely manner. If you're trying to switch from another EHR, the transition is incredibly easy. They'll import your demographic data free of charge, so you can get going right away. So if you're curious, or you want to switch, or you need a new EHR, try Therapy Notes for 2 months, absolutely free. You can go to thetestingpsychologist.com/therapy notes and enter the code TESTING. Again, totally free, no strings attached. Check it out and see why everyone is switching to therapy notes.
I'm excited to tell you about PAR's all-new PAR training platform, an elevated online learning environment with everything you need in one place. This is the new home for PAR Talks webinars, many of which offer APA and NASP-approved CEs, and also houses on-demand learning tools and PAR product training resources. Best of all, it is free. Totally free. To learn more, visit parinc.com/resources/PAR-training. All right, let's get back to the podcast.
Sure. Yeah. Well, to me, at this point, it feels very second nature. And I might add that I think I have sort of the extra help of, the fact that I'm a psychoanalyst. And so, for me, connecting the dots and the past and the unconscious is something that I'm very keen on. But I think what's really hard, to be honest, is staying objective and neutral.
See that?
Which is so important, because here I am saying the U.S. immigration system is biased. Okay? Well, I can't be biased. I'm the one who brings the objectivity to the playing field, right?
Seems very hard.
I'm the one who's saying, right, yes, it is hard. It is hard. But it's so meaningful, so important for these cases. I can talk about, I have research to back me up. We went to school for this. The officer reading the report didn't. And so we're educating them in a way, but, very tactfully.
Of course.
Right? And in a way that we don't come across as advocates. Because if you come across as an advocate, then the report loses its weight. How
do you do that? That seems very challenging.
It is challenging. And it's something that I'm constantly working on. That's part of the, what I do is I'm constantly in communication with immigration attorneys. I go to like AILA conferences, which is the American Immigration Lawyers Association, to learn about new trends and what's happening. And so just to give you one example, we had an in-house training from an immigration attorney on TV sets, just because they're so new and, we're trying to really do a good job. And she explained to us like why it's so important to not put so much background information on these reports, to not describe the trafficking in detail, which might be counterintuitive, right? Exactly. But she had a very valid explanation. I'm explaining it. The client is writing it in their declaration. We have other evidence. We don't need you to repeat it, right? Especially if that's going to open the door to inconsistencies, because they will latch on to any inconsistency to basically say, like, were you lying then or are you lying now? Right? Yes. That's sort of the attitude. So the important thing, the reason we come to you is not for you to tell what happened, but to talk about how it impacted the person that only you as a mental health professional can do. You can have that perspective.
I'm just, I think I'm just noticing like the maybe admiration and respect for clinicians, who do this, because it just seems like that takes so much self-awareness and monitoring, because I mean, as human nature, like what I'm gathering from the way you describe this is like the USCIS, right, is like their vibe, so to speak, is to be pretty detail oriented. They scrutinize, and they're not coming at this from a place of like trying to help people, really. It's like, how can we screen out these individuals and like, get them out of the country?
Exactly.
And so I think it's human nature to want to like push against that, and like do a counterbalancing kind of approach. But you just said, like, if we come across as too much of an advocate, that's going to set off alarm bells as well.
Exactly. They'll say that you're biased.
Yes.
And, how do we know you're not exaggerating? And how do you know that, how do we know that you took everything into consideration? And a lot of these cases are not adjudicated in court. They're decided administratively. So you never get to talk to the adjudicator. The client never gets to talk to the adjudicator. It's all paperwork. So you really have to get your point across. Like, one thing that I always say is, like, you need to be 2 steps ahead. You need to, think like the reader and think, what is a reader going to argue? Like, yes, but, right? And address it. Like, jump right into it and address it before they have that argument that might at best elicit a request for more evidence, which just delays the whole process and costs more money. And at worst can just, like, they can just decide against the case.
Right. This situation, these evals seem like they are also just sort of rife for our own biases, right? I mean, like, confirmation bias, mainly. Like, individuals are coming in and, like, you want to be an advocate, you want to be helpful. So, I guess I'm curious how you work against that as well. It's kind of a similar question, to how do you stay objective? But I wonder, I mean, like, does anyone come in and you actually say, well, I don't see any hardship here. I don't see any evidence for that.
Yeah. I mean, thankfully they're properly screened. The attorneys that we work with, I created this, like, screener that they can give to their clients to see if they would benefit from a psych evaluation. And so some of them actually give it to them. And they know that it costs money and it takes time. So, I mean, and if attorneys are sending them, they're usually, like, pretty good attorneys who know that a psych evaluation would help. So it's not as common as you would think, but it is. As a matter of fact, we had one yesterday. One of my clinicians, called me and she's like, I don't know what to do. This guy is a total pro-Trumper who's saying, like, they need to build a wall and keep everybody outside except for his wife. And he went on a rant of 45 minutes. And it was like, oh, wow. Okay, well, we can talk about it. So I don't have any more details about it, but I don't know how good of a case this might be. And then in that case, we might just end up either not writing the report and, of course, telling them that it's not going to be in their favor. Or we might just kind of shift gears, and that instead of addressing that referral question, we might turn it into a psychodiagnostic evaluation and let the attorney use it however they want to use it, right? So if we're diagnosing this person, suffers from anxiety and they need treatment, and, this is what's going to happen if they don't get treatment, or whatever it is, right, that they want us to do, and then let the attorney work their skills into fitting it in and making it helpful for their case. That's not our job, right? The attorneys are the ones who know what to do. But for the most part, there's very little, you'd be surprised because there's so much secondary gain, but there's very little malingering in this population. There's some exaggeration, but again, we need to understand it. The exaggeration is from a place of desperation, because again, this is so unfair. How do I prove to you that this is going to hurt me, to, like, ruin my life in some cases, right? So we need to look beyond that and not say, like, well, he exaggerated, he was malingering. Like, there's not even need to mention that, because you understand what that means. And you can look beyond. That's why, all the self-report measures and stuff, they add that quote unquote objective evidence. There's nothing objective about a self-report measure, but it looks good on paper, right? But ultimately, it's your own clinical judgment, in having years of working with human beings and understanding how their minds work, how their defenses pop up, how they react in the face of fear, in the face of uncertainty, in the aftermath of trauma, etc.
Yes. So we haven't talked much about the battery. You bring up self-report measures. We talked about the interview, the sort of the consult and then the interview, and then what does the actual testing look like, or the assessment process maybe?
Right. So everybody's different. I think some people don't do any testing at all. So it depends for the type of case, right? In general, I do, like the SCID, right? The semi-structured clinical interview for DSM-5 disorders, which, I sort of have a system where I give them a questionnaire of symptoms that I developed, that I came up with. And then based on their answers to that, then during the interview, I ask them more follow-up questions to get to the root of it, right? So you're saying I'm feeling sad. Well, tell me more about that sadness. Is it more days than not? Is all the flow chart, right, of the SCID interview. I also give them an attachment measure to assess their attachment style in cases where it's about the relationship. I like the projective testing because of my background, so I like the sentence completion. And you'd be surprised, I get so much from those responses. Just reading through, I notice some themes. I see what's important to them, what their values are. Now, of course, you're not going to base any conclusions on any one test. And no test is going to, sort of taint the rest of the information that you have. So you take it all in the aggregate, right? And you look at it qualitatively as well. Are they second guessing themselves a lot? Yeah, it says nothing about what they're writing on the actual questionnaire, but it tells me something about them as a person, their personality, yes. Right? So in the quote unquote bigger tests, I like the PAI, the personality assessment instrument, because it talks more about their strengths or weaknesses, their ways of relating with others. I find it to be quite accurate. I've done others, but for instance, like the MCMI, because it was normed in a clinical population, it tends to over-pathologize or to accuse people of like minimizing, denying when they're totally okay. So, and the PAI doesn't really do that. So that's one that I really like. If I'm assessing trauma, the TSI, the trauma symptom inventory too, I really like that one because again, and both of those have validity scales as well that make them a lot more objective. And yeah, I really like that one because it goes beyond just symptoms, right? It talks about how they cope, how they see themselves, etc.
Right.
So those are, I think, like the two biggest ones, the longest ones that we give.
Sure.
I would say.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic.
And then I didn't say, so it doesn't end with the interview, then we write the report. But for that, then the clients, when they leave and then we write the report, I always follow sort of the same format. That's just the stylization, right? There isn't one way to write it. And then we can either send it to the client or they can sign a release and we send it directly to the attorney, which 99% of people prefer that just because, they want to keep it all together in one place. And I don't know, they just prefer that.
Sure. That makes sense to me. Yeah. So this is all happening essentially in 1 or 2 days, and then you write the report.
Yeah. So people vary here. Some people like to have separate interviews. Listen, I'm an analyst. I see people 4 times a week. So for me, the more, the merrier. However, right? But for this population and for these cases, I'm also a forensic psychologist. So I go to jails and evaluate people in just one sitting. And that's enough. It's enough for the court. It's enough to answer the referral question. So this is kind of the same thing. If, I pretty, with the exception of some situations where, they're re-traumatized, it's really hard to get through, or perhaps something happens that we need to interrupt and continue on a different day. I typically just do it in just one sitting. And the reason for that I do this is not for me, but more for them, because these are people who are all, typically working, or if, they're not working, they're caring for a child, or so coming to see me takes a big effort. They have to take time off work. They have to have somebody watch their children. They have to make their way down here. Perhaps they don't have transportation. And so I just want to make it easier on them. If it were up to me, yes, I'd stretch it out as long as I could. But I'm confident that I can get the information that I need to answer the referral question in just one sitting. Why? Because I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm asking. I know what I'm looking for.
That makes sense. Well said.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we start to close. This has been incredibly helpful. And I wonder if we start to close with some myths around these evals, because, clinicians may be thinking about getting into this work. And I think there are some myths that are worth addressing. And love for you to speak to those.
Well, I mean, some of the things that I hear a lot is, they think that they have to be bilingual to do this type of work. Well, first of all, you're working with immigrants from all over the world, right? So you should be like, what's the word for people who speak like more than 5 languages? I forget what it is. But anyway, right? That's impossible. So absolutely not. First of all, a lot of the evaluations are conducted in English because the people speak English, especially the cancellation or removal or the waivers, because it's the U.S. citizen or U.S. resident that's coming in to see you. So those are carried out in English. And then there's also the use of interpreters. And, I have a lot to say about interpreters because I used to be an interpreter many, many years ago. Yeah. And so I like to, meet with them ahead of time, kind of train them, because this is very different than what they're used to. Interpreters typically go to doctors' offices, go to court, right? They're not there listening to some traumatic story that might actually elicit some feelings in them, like their own history, their own trauma history. Because, if they're speaking the same language, it's also likely that they come from the same region, especially if it's a dialect, right? So very important to know how to work with that interpreter, but they are extremely helpful. I mean, you can do a very good interview with the aid of an interpreter. So yes, you don't have to be bilingual. Of course, it helps if you speak in a language. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and it's great because a lot of the referrals that I get are in Spanish, but I also get referrals, people who speak Arabic or Vietnamese or Chinese or, all kinds of different languages.
Great. Well, and I wonder if that's another myth, is that, all of these evals are with Spanish-speaking individuals,
Yeah, that's definitely a myth. But again, it depends on where you live. I'm in San Diego. We're right next door to Mexico. So we do get a lot of Spanish speakers. Absolutely. But we also have a very large Middle Eastern community here. So we have like one interpreter who speaks Arabic, and we work with her, consistently. She's almost like part of the team because we're working with those people so much. But so depending on where you live, it could be Punjabi, it could be, again, Chinese, Portuguese, wherever you are, that might be the referrals that you get more of.
I see. So being bilingual, that's a myth. What else? Any other myths that you are seeing coming up? Testifying? What about testifying? Are you going to court a lot?
Oh, yes. Okay, good. Yeah, so the interesting thing about these cases is a lot of them are not adjudicated in court.
Okay.
So like waivers, like a U visa, a T visa, they're not going to court. So there's absolutely no risk of testifying. And even those who do go to court, like cancellation or removal and asylum, it's not like in the criminal system where you get a subpoena and you have to go, or you get deposed, right? It's really not adversarial like that at all. So usually what ends up happening is, either the attorney, which I think is going to happen a lot more now, the attorney wants to cover all their bases and say, you wrote a great report, but just in case they have a question about it, I want to have you there as a witness. If they have any issues, I want to be able to say like, oh, let's call her in and she can testify. Or they may have gone in for a hearing and there were some issues with the report, with your opinion. And so the the U.S., the government attorney or the judge, the immigration judge, might say, we need some clarification on some things. And so they'll invite you. It's not you don't get a subpoena. They'll just, and again, I want to help my clients' cases. So you would just go, and it's somewhat adversarial just in the fact, the voir dire that they do for any type of testimony where they try to basically to demonstrate that what qualifies you as an expert. And then the opposing side is going to try to poke holes on that. So that's not super pleasant.
Of course.
But at the end of the day, like, you're being very objective. You have the information that you got, you have your knowledge, and that's what you're speaking to. You're not speaking for the client. You do the best you can.
Sure.
Right? And they're bringing you in as the expert, as the one who knows about something that they don't know about.
Right.
But even with that, I have to say, I've testified about 5 times in my entire career. And I've even signed off on more than 2,000 evaluations.
Oh, gosh.
So it's not very common. But I don't know what's going to happen this year with this administration. I don't know if they're going to want us there just in case, or if judges are going to be like, I want to talk to this doctor. I don't want to, I don't want to just read the report, or I really have no idea. So maybe we can meet back in a year and I can give you an update.
Yeah, I would welcome that. Yeah, things are changing in the moment.
Yeah. And then along those same lines, if you're a person who's like, absolutely not, the thought of going into a courthouse, really frightens me, just don't take cases that are adjudicated in court.
Sounds
easy
enough.
You're good to go. Or, and tell attorneys, hey, FYI, I'm doing this evaluation. I'll write a great report, but don't ask me to testify. I can't testify. And they might say, no, this case is pretty straightforward. We're good. Or they might say, okay, then maybe I'm going to go with somebody else just in case. But either way, you don't have to testify.
Right. Well said. Well, gosh, we have covered a lot. I think a lot of the logistical and the sort of philosophical or emotional components of this whole process. And I think it's incredibly timely, like you said. And, for better or for worse, if nothing else, clinicians, I think, can look at this as, hey, there's a real opportunity here to do some good. And
and the cool thing about this work is that many, I train people, and many of the people I train are perhaps like clinical social workers or professional counselors or, MFTs. And they never thought that they could get involved in the forensic field because they don't have that training. But if you get the adequate training for doing these evaluations, you have the training, the education, the knowledge. That's all you need to qualify as an expert. Doesn't matter what your degree is.
Yeah,
right?
That's important.
So that's what I really like about this is that it doesn't close the door to other types of mental health professionals who want to do this work. That's, very rewarding emotionally, which again, don't let that come across in the report, but it is, it is rewarding. You're doing a very good job. And quite frankly, it can be lucrative. It's a great way to diversify your practice to, instead of being dependent on or seeing patients, number of patients per week, you might say, instead of so many patients, I might supplement with an evaluation. You don't have to dedicate yourself to just do this. This is not, by all means, is not all I do.
That's great. That's a great point. I mean, it has to be financially sustainable.
Right.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, this is awesome. I mean, if people want to reach out, want to learn more, what is the best way to do that?
Well, they can go on my website, which is psychevalcoach.com. And there I actually have a free guide if they want more information on specific cases and what they entail and what this work, really looks like. I have a free guide, introductory guide to immigration evaluations that they can download and learn a bit more about it.
Love it. We love free stuff. Thank you. Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. It was great to connect with you again and talk through something that, I think is super timely and really important for our country right now. So, great to see you again.
I agree. Yeah. Okay. You too, Jeremy. Thank you.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Always grateful to have you here. I hope that you take away some information that you can implement in your practice and in your life. Any resources that we mentioned during the episode will be listed in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. If you like what you hear on the podcast, I would be so grateful if you left a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're a practice owner or aspiring practice owner, I'd invite you to check out the Testing Psychologist mastermind groups. I have mastermind groups at every stage of practice development, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. We have homework, we have accountability, we have support, we have resources. These groups are amazing. We do a lot of work and a lot of connecting. If that sounds interesting to you, you can check out the details at thetestingpsychologist.com/consulting. You can sign up for a pre-group phone call and we will chat and figure out if a group could be a good fit for you. Thanks so much. The information contained in this podcast and on the Testing Psychologist website are intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no doctor-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host or guests of this podcast and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of any mental health practitioner or medical provider, please seek one in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please find a supervisor with an expertise that fits your needs.